All right. Good morning, church. Good morning. Good to see you this morning. Good to see you. Welcome those that are watching with us. You know, I see a little bit of red today as we got Valentine's Day in 2 days. So if you have forgot about that, you've got 2 days to do something nice. Do something nice. It reminded me of a story of a husband and wife, and the husband went to the doctor one day, and he was just for his regular checkup, and the doctor says, "Is there anything else I can help you with?" And he said, "Doc, I'm afraid my wife has losing her hearing." He said, "I think she is becoming deaf. She doesn't hear anything I say." And he said, "Well, that could be a problem." He said, "I'll tell you what, when you get home, we need to test her out to see what level she is at of losing her hearing." So he says, "Okay, great." So the doctor tells him what to do. He says, "Start about 15 feet behind her, asking her questions, and then if she doesn't answer, you keep going up." So he gets about 15 feet behind her when he gets home. She's in there chopping vegetables and doing some things, and he says, "Honey, what's for supper?" She says, "Absolutely nothing." So he walks about 5 feet closer and he says, "Honey, what's for supper?" Still no response. He says, "All right, I'm going to keep going." So he gets about 5 feet from her and he says, "Honey, what's for supper?" Still nothing. Well, he's aggravated now. So he gets right behind her, which is dangerous because she was chopping vegetables. And he got right behind her and he says, "Honey, what's for supper?" And she says, "For the 4th time, we're having vegetable soup." I think we figured out who was having the problem there. And he was getting ready to get himself in the fire. And we're going to be looking at Daniel 3 this morning. And Daniel 3 talks about the fire and how God will not only take us through trials and he takes us through the fire, but he's there with us. And we're going to look at an old familiar story to a lot of you that we read about in Sunday school and we learned growing up about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But I think it's important for the context and for us to get in our mind what was going on that we read the whole chapter of Daniel 3. So just bear with me. Let's go through it together. It's about 30 verses, but I think we need to understand the beginning to the end of Daniel 3. Daniel 3:1 says, "Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps and the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials from all the provinces. He sends word to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up for himself. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up." Verse 4 says, "Then a herald cried out, 'To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, you will fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up.' Verse 6 says, 'And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace.' So at that time when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down, and they worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Therefore at that time a certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image.' Verse 11 tells us, 'And whoever does not fall and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace.' There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to him. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "It is true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image which I have set up. Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar," I love this, "we have no need to answer you in this matter." Verse 17 says, "If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king." Verse 18 says, "But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, full of fury, and the expression of his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he spoke and he commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times hotter than it normally is heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats and their trousers and their turbans and their other garments, and they were cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed the men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste, and he spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking around in the midst of the fire. They're not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. Verse 27 says, "And the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together. They saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them." Verse 28, so Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants, whom trusted in him. They have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no God who can deliver like this." And then verse 30 tells us, "Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon." Wow, what a story, right? That's already an amazing story. That story is one of those that we read about in the Bible. It's one of the greatest stories of deliverance in the Bible. It rivals up there with David and Goliath. It rivals up there with Daniel in the lion's den. It tells us that we serve a God that is a living God that can do anything. And he sometimes, and if we think eternally, always delivers his faithful servants from death. It tells us to honor God under the most severe circumstances. When honoring him seemingly ensures a bad outcome, when it seemingly ensures our death, God will honor us. That brings us to the first point this morning. Sometimes God lets us go through the fire. Sometimes God will let us go through the fire. In this case, we're speaking literally, right? But I'm speaking figuratively. God could have delivered these 3 men from facing the fire. He could have stopped Nebuchadnezzar from throwing them into the fire. But instead, God chose to deliver them through the fire. You know, whatever kind of fire or trial that you face in life, sometimes God won't deliver you from that trial. He may deliver you through the trial. In fact, there are times where he leads us into the trial. And you may be at some place in your life right now. You may say, Jason, I'm in a good place. Or you may say, I just stepped into a trial. Or you may be saying, Jason, I am right in the middle of a fiery trial this morning. Or you may say, I've got victory, praise God, I just come out of something. I just come out of something that I've been going through. Somewhere you are in that point in your life this morning. And whatever a fire or trial you're facing this morning, God may not deliver you from the trial. He may deliver you through the trial. In fact, there are times where he leads us into that trial. The story reminds me of the story we read about when the disciples were being directed by Jesus to row their boat across the Sea of Galilee, and night falls and he stays behind, and they're in the middle of the night. Here comes a storm. The storm blows up. They're concerned that they're going to perish. How are we going to make it? And then we read, and Jesus shows up. Jesus shows up walking on the water and rescues them. That's the God we serve. I like reading about in Proverbs 17:3. We look at this verse. It says, the refining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the hearts. In other words, this experience of the three Hebrew young men here is often the way God deals with us. He uses trials. He uses hot fires to refine us. To refine us like gold. The Lord is not about refining silver or gold, but he is all about refining the hearts of his people. He had already done so with these three young men in Daniel 1 and 2. They had resolved not to defile their hearts with the king's choice food. They had resolved not to do some of those things that the king wanted them to do. They had prayed to the Lord that Daniel would receive both King Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the interpretation. And when their lives were on the line, God came through. God blessed them. Their hearts had been refined already. They had already learned what it meant to honor God. They could trust that God would honor them. So when they encountered this incredible trial, when they faced the fire, literally a fiery furnace that had been heated 7 times hotter than normal, their faith had been so strengthened that they did not hesitate to stand against the king's command and stand for God's command. They trusted God that no matter what, and obeyed no matter what. And of course, it was a matter of obedience. Any doubt in our mind, we should consider the 10 Commandments. They were vital. They were central to the law of the Jews, the law of Moses. And we read the first couple commandments. You should have no other gods before me. You should not worship any graven image as though of a god. These were 2 of the top commandments. It was vital for them to observe these commandments, to worship their God in spirit, but also to worship their God in truth. They were not willing to compromise. They were not willing to back down from an issue, as we should not be willing to compromise or back down any issue where our faith in Jesus Christ is involved. God came through for them. What a God, what a story, what a Savior, what a deliverance that we read about here. Now, is there a chance that you're going to be tested with a trial? Is there a chance I'm going to be tested with a trial? I'd say yes. I don't know. We don't know when that's going to happen in our lives, but we do know that the Apostle Peter spoke about fiery trials, and he told us not to be surprised when one comes our way. He told us in 1 Peter 4:12 and 13, we read the scriptures, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you." Verse 13, he says, "But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy." We look at that verse and we say, rejoice? Rejoice? Yes, he says rejoice as we partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, we may also have exceeding joy. I don't know how about you, but somehow I'm often surprised about where I am in my life and different stages of my life and how things happen. If you'd have told me 15 years ago that, Jason, one day you'd be working for a church, I would have said, you're crazy. I'm not going to do that. I have no desire to do that. If you'd have told me 6 months ago I'd be standing up here this morning, I'd say, you're crazy. I'm not going to have any part of that. I'm not going to do that. But God refines our hearts. God starts changing our hearts. And when we're obedient, like these three men were, when God opens that door, you walk through the door. Yes, Lord, I'm a little fearful here, but I'm willing to do what you want me to do. He starts changing our hearts. He starts refining us like the fire, like the gold in the fire. How did we get here? Sometimes we say, tough times, God, where are you? Sometimes we say, God, how could you let this happen? But we don't see that response from these three men. We don't see that from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego here. Even though it's tough, we don't see that. It is as though they had been prepared for this very kind of thing to happen. They are incredibly bold and they're confident in their response to this pagan tyrant king. I love it. They say, "Oh, king, we don't have to answer you in this matter." They told him, "We will not bow down and worship your image. And yes, our God is able to rescue us from your hands, but whether he does or not, we won't compromise. We won't bow down. We'll continue to stand for our God." They must have been prepared, I think, in advance of these things. I think they probably had already sat there and talked about stuff the king might try to make them do. And in my mind, I think maybe they said to themselves, I won't be surprised if this king tries to make us worship his idols. And they must have resolved in their heart that no matter what happened, no matter how fiery the trial they were about to endure, they would not compromise. How about us? Have we prepared for the fiery ordeal that Peter says we shouldn't be surprised by? Do we know, do we have an answer? Do we have an answer this morning? Do we know how we would answer a demand to deny our faith at the point of a sword? Yes, we've read about the disciples and the people in the Bible that were martyred, that stood for their faith and died because they would not give in to their faith. They would not deny it. They would not bow down. They would not compromise. We read about missionaries and other people throughout all the years in history that have stood for the faith, wouldn't deny the faith, even at the blade, at the point of a sword. I think it's important for Jesus said about this, how we should respond in every circumstances in our relationship with him. And we read that in Matthew 10:32 and 33. Jesus tells us, we read in Matthew, "Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will confess before my Father who is in heaven." In verse 33, we get the dark side of that. "Whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven." You know, when you're facing the fire, prepare in advance for what you might say, for what you will say. Prepare to stand no matter what the cost, because God may well take you through the fire as he did these three. Our second point today is sometimes, oftentimes, when God leads us through a fire, he shows up in himself in the fire. Oh, aren't we glad to have that promise this morning? That when we're going through something, we could turn around and realize God is right there with us. He is leading us through there. If God makes us go through the fire, don't be surprised if God himself somehow shows up in ways that you typically don't see him show up. I could think about in my life. I could think of different trials and fires, different things that God has brought me through. And even though we don't understand, how am I in this situation? Why are you letting me go through this? But I can think about how it strengthens you, how it refines you, how it makes you stronger. It strengthens your faith. It makes you a better Christian. It makes your relationship better with him. When we learn just to depend on him, you're there with me. Let's go. Let's go through it. It's hard to do, but I think God tells us sometimes you just got to walk through, but I'll be with you. Of course, that's exactly what happened in this situation. God, in the form of someone who looked like the Son of God, the Bible says, actually did visibly show up. Of course, this was the Son of God. And there are a number of occasions that when God showed up in the Old Testament as under the appearance of a man. He did so with Abraham just before Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. He did so with Joshua as the captain of the Lord's armies just before the battle of Jericho. He did so here, literally in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And guess who else noticed him? Yes, the pagan tyrant king, King Nebuchadnezzar, noticed what was going on. I suspect not only Nebuchadnezzar noticed what was going on, but what about all those high-ranking Babylonian officials that had come in for this celebration? All of them had come from all over the provinces, all the high-ranking officials and leaders to, at Nebuchadnezzar's request, What do you think they thought when they looked in there and they saw 4 men in the fire themselves? I suspect they were amazed. The strongest soldiers, we read, of the Babylon army had thrown these 3 men into the fire. And the flames were so hot that they died doing so. And then over their dead bodies, there's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego continue to walk around within the flames themselves. And there's the Son of God with them in the fire. If God makes you go through the fire, he will go through the fire with you. And sometimes he will make his presence obvious. He may manifest himself in a supernatural way that he does not usually do at any other time. Imagine how these 3 felt as they found themselves consumed by the flames, walking around unharmed by the flames, and the Son of God with them. How surreal. How incredible. Yes, God is their rock. God is their fortress. God was their deliverer. And God was who they trust. Is there anything that our God can't do? Now, I'm sure for some of us, we've gone through those trials and fires, and maybe we didn't physically see the Son of God, but we experienced his presence. We experienced a miracle he did in our lives, his astounding personal presence delivering us in ways that were just beyond our faith and beyond our expectation. Often in answer to other people's prayers uttered in faith for us. Oh, I'm thankful for prayers. I'm thankful that you pray for me. I pray for you. I think there's something about the prayer of God's people as we care about each other. We care about what's going on in each other's lives, praying for each other in good times and bad. I think there's something about that. I love it. I love prayer. Oh, church, he's a wonder-working, faithful God who's the same yesterday, the same today, and the same forever. But if you will stand for him, as those 3 young men did, he will in one way or another show up even as he showed up for them. So we might ask this morning, why didn't God show up before them and keep them from being bound and thrown into the fire? Why didn't he show up and he stop them from having to go through this? Well, let me ask you this morning. Which is the better story? Them being rescued before they went into the fire, or them being rescued out of the fire? Either one would be the good story, but the best story that we have told over and over again and heard all of our lives through the years is this version we have here today. When God delivered these 3 young men through the fire, just as he did here. And when he does deliver you through the fire as he did here, it will be the best story as well. Why does God do it this way? I think sometimes God does it this way for his greater glory and his greater good. Look at what happened here. Nebuchadnezzar, this tyrant king who had little regard for human life and suffering, he gets up off his throne. He approaches the fiery furnace because there's not 3 in there. There's 4 walking around. He's never seen anything like it. Remember, he's the person who had just challenged the God of the Jews by making the statement, and what God is there who can deliver you out of my hand? You think, I think when people come to God like that and they challenge God like that, I think those are fighting words to God. When someone lays down such a challenge, when someone defies the living God like Nebuchadnezzar had just done, our God has determined that his name will be exalted among the nations. His name will be exalted among the Gentiles. He's going to act for his glory. It's the same thing he did for David, who was cursed by Goliath. He did the same thing here. And so Nebuchadnezzar is just a little impressed. And now he calls on these 3 young men. He says, come out of the fire. Come out of the fire. And the only thing that has been burned when they come out is the rope that bound them. All his highly placed government officials are there. They see this. They see this in wonder and in amazement. They see not a hair on their head is singed. Not a thread of their garments are burned. And even there is no smell of fire upon them. How could this be? It could not unless their God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. And he has decided to use the faith and obedience of these 3 young men to exalt himself in the sight of this arrogant king and all his officials. You've got to wonder how many of these officials, these pagans, went home believers in the God of the Jews that day. You got to wonder how many they went and told about what had happened. Now we know later on that this is the seed, and later on Nebuchadnezzar's salvation would come later. Now Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of the chapter here, he issues a proclamation in all his world-conquering kingdom that exists, that exalts the God of the Jews. He ordered the proclamation made to all the pagans who would hear around the world. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, tongue that speaks anything offensive about the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be torn limb from limb. Their house reduced to a rubbish heap. Inasmuch there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. And what do you want to bet? Lives that were changed that day when people left there and started telling all over the kingdom of what this God has done. This God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. How they'd been thrown in the fiery furnace and how they'd been brought out. How he stood in there with them when they were in there. You know, church, I think it was their integrity of these men that triggered the miracle. It was their integrity that allowed God to show up that day. That allowed God to show off that day. Their integrity paid off. Verse 30 says, then the king promoted them in the province of Babylon. Bottom line is when you do the right thing, God will do the right thing with you. If we do the right thing, God will do the right thing by us. You know, as we close this morning, we all have a little bit of Nebuchadnezzar in us. Now, we may have not built a 90-foot statue in our front yard for everybody to come see. But we get upset when people don't bow down to our wishes. We've never thrown anybody in a fiery furnace, I hope, but our anger heats up when we don't get things our way. You know, we seek worship in more subtle ways. We exaggerate with things. We put down others behind our back. We tell white lies to hide the gray areas of our life. But church, if you don't find your identity and security in what Christ has accomplished for you on the cross, then you'll hide your insecurities behind your hypocrisy. You'll try to fight your own battles, create your own opportunities, establish your own reputation. But you know what? Sometimes God makes us go through the fire. But remember this, He'll be there with you. He'll be there standing with you. You'll be more greatly blessed. He will be far more greatly glorified because of it. Faith for deliverance is not faith in God. Faith means whether I am visibly delivered or not, I will stick to my belief that God is God. There are some things that only can be learned in a fiery furnace. So church, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that may come upon you, but be prepared to stand for the Lord no matter what the potential outcome is, no matter what the potential consequence is. Be prepared to stand. And as you are prepared to stand, stand back and see the glory of God one way or another.
Thank you for being part of our service today. Our prayer at Zion's Cause is that this service drew you closer to the Lord Jesus Christ. We look forward to you joining us again next week. On behalf of the pastor, staff, and congregation, may God richly bless you and keep you.